Joining us with more insight on the developments in the Middle East is Donald Rothwell. He's a professor of international law at Australian National University. Thank you so much for joining us, Professor. Firstly, I want to get your reaction to the ceasefire confusion. Why do you think this deal was interpreted so differently, and why is Lebanon such a pivotal factor?
Look, I think partly because we know that President Trump had set a deadline for around this time yesterday morning in both Singapore and Southeast Asia and Australia here. And clearly that agreement, whatever it was reached at the 11th hour, and President Trump wanted to make an announcement prior to his imposed deadline in Washington. So inevitably there were some finer details of that which were not settled. But I think the other interesting dynamic associated with this was that whilst Pakistan had been able to negotiate this as an intermediary, as a mediator with the United States and Iran, Israel were not really quite clear as to what role Israel really played in these negotiations. And just from the conduct of Israel over the last 24 hours in terms of continuing its military operations in Lebanon, literally Israel doesn't feel that it's really bound by these ceasefire arrangements that have been settled, at least in broad terms.
Professor, I want to ask you to help us look past the confusion at this point. Everything seemingly points to the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz as a crucial starting point. As a point of law, I wonder if you think what Iran has done so far in terms of closing the strait is legal. And if we take this forward, if Iran wants some control, or if there's a joint toll arrangement between the US and Iran, is anything or is any of that legal according to international law and maritime conventions?
Yeah, first of all, I think we need to acknowledge that we've been in the middle of an armed conflict now for 5 weeks, and during an armed conflict, the way in which normal navigation rights would apply through the strait are effectively suspended, certainly between the belligerents, and even for those countries who are not belligerents, who are flying neutral flags, their ability for their shipping to naturally, safely travel through the strait would be significantly be compromised, given the fact that it's an area of military operation. But moving forward, some of the discussions that we're seeing about Iran seeking to impose tolls on vessels passing through the strait, that's not really consistent in any way with our understanding of the international law of the sea as it applies to international straits, of which the Straits of Malacca and Singapore are very prominent examples of that. And there's been a very long-standing position that international law doesn't acknowledge the imposition of tolls, and importantly, that's a principle that the United States has very staunchly upheld for many decades.
And Professor, there are reports that different versions of the 10-point plan are circulating, even the White House saying that the latest version isn't what Mr. Trump considered workable. Who do you think is really in control in Iran, and how much does this internal division in Iran complicate reaching a lasting deal?
Look, we know that the United States has been fairly successful in terms of its so-called decapitation strategy in terms of the Iranian leadership. And so, yes, you're right. We really don't have a clear sense as to who is in control of the Iranian regime at the moment. But on the other hand, we can take some confidence that someone from Iran has been engaged in those negotiations that the Pakistanis have been leading, and that there was obviously some agreement, because in addition to President Trump yesterday announcing the broad details of the ceasefire, the Iranians were also broadly announcing and celebrating the success of the ceasefire and outlining the terms and the conditions that they had set. So there is clearly some political uncertainty, but also we're getting political uncertainty from Washington as to what exactly the terms of the ceasefire arrangement are. I think the next 24, 48 hours will be critical in terms of the finalisation of the ceasefire arrangements, and there are meetings scheduled in Islamabad in the very near future to try to settle those, with US Vice President J.D. Vance scheduled to attend those meetings.
Professor, Iran kept the Strait of Hormuz closed. I think Julie mentioned this earlier in response to Israeli attacks on Lebanon. Why is Lebanon, if you like, non-negotiable for Israel? And we have the US also saying the same thing in the meantime. And how damaging do you think this might be, for the truce and also the ceasefire talks, which are due to take place at the end of the week?
Yeah, and I think one of the important elements that we always need to recall is that, of course, one of the reasons why the United States and Israel launched this military operation against the Iranians was not only because of Iran's nuclear capability or concerns over its nuclear capability, but also because of the actions of Iranian proxies within the region. We know, of course, about Hamas, but also Hezbollah and also the Houthis. And Hezbollah, of course, commenced military operations by firing rockets against Israel very soon after the conflict broke out. And so Israel, as we know, has then launched a very significant military campaign in Lebanon to not only disarm Hezbollah, but also once again to really weaken it. So to that end, this has effectively become a very major goal for the Israelis in this campaign. They've really left the Iranian campaign very much to the United States. So Israel taking this opportunity to really weaken Hezbollah, to completely eradicate Hezbollah from southern Lebanon is clearly an important military objective for the Israelis at the moment. And so I'm not surprised that the Israelis are really trying to siphon out that whole issue with respect to Hezbollah and Lebanon. But on the other hand, of course, not surprisingly, Iran, because of their strong support for Hezbollah historically, is really saying, well, unless Lebanon is included in this ceasefire arrangement, there's really no effective ceasefire deal.
And Professor, one interesting thing that Mr. Trump said was that he is considering a joint venture with Iran to charge tolls on ships passing through the Strait of Hormuz. Just how realistic is that idea, and how worried should we be about countries starting to use these major trade routes as leverage?
Yeah, and I think this is particularly concerning. And so the basic principle that we work with is the freedom of navigation, that ships are able to freely pass through international straits and along the territorial sea of coasts. And so if we think about a land-based analogy, we think about freeways in which cars can freely move up and down highways as opposed to a tollway. So there's nothing at all under international law. There's no real precedent under international law in which ships are expected to pay effectively a toll or a fee to be able to pass through various international straits. This has consistently been the position really since post-World War II, and it's been consistently upheld in the 1982 UN Law of the Sea Convention. It's also consistently upheld in state practice. And I think just in the last few hours, the Greek Prime Minister has come out very strongly emphasising that, yes, there needs to be a settlement and there needs to be freedom of navigation guaranteed through the Strait of Hormuz, but there should be no discussion at all about the permanent imposition of tolls. So I think that there will be significant pushback from major states within the international community about any joint US-Iranian proposal to put forward a toll regime effectively for the Straits.
Okay, Professor Rothwell, we'll have to leave it there for now. Thank you very much for your time. And Donald Rothwell, Professor of International Law at the Australian National University.